The following records do not exist. Part 3. The Ill Political Anti-McVeigh. Post-Gulf War, U.S. Army, Fort Riley. Introduction. Sometime after March 26, 1991, Special Forces hopefuls Timothy McVeigh and Mitch Whitmire left the deserts of Kuwait and Iraq and returned to Fort Riley. On April 3, 1991, both arrived at Fort Bragg to begin the 21-day Special Forces Assessment and Selection, or SFAS, course. In all later accounts written about McVeigh or the Oklahoma bombing, the Special Forces tryout is a pivotal moment, a crossroads after which his later act of domestic terrorism became a foregone conclusion for reasons that vary depending on the particular narrative being told. From this point forward, the story of Timothy McVeigh branches off on a number of different, highly conflicting trajectories, determined by one's conclusion about what happened at the tryout and McVeigh's reaction to it. The Special Forces washout. The most commonly told and widely accepted version of McVeigh's Special Forces tryout appeared in early news reports, unauthorized biographies, and was told in the courtroom by prosecutors at McVeigh's criminal trial. It is best encapsulated in McVeigh's 2001 authorized biography, American Terrorist. In this story, only hours after arriving at Fort Bragg, both McVeigh and Whitmire very quickly realized how out of shape they had become while in the Gulf, and the negative impact this was having on their performance there. In addition, as the story goes, on the very first day, McVeigh, who was breaking in a new pair of combat boots, developed a blister on his foot during a rucksack march. The blister plagued him so terribly that he privately concluded he could not realistically complete the course. Later that afternoon, he and Whitmire discussed their situation, and both decided to voluntarily withdraw from the course, agreeing between themselves to try again later after getting back in shape. Thereafter, both returned to Fort Riley. When the rest of Charlie Company returned from the Gulf, they were surprised, even shocked, at finding McVeigh at the base and not secreted away on a covert Special Forces mission, a goal he had obsessively prepared for throughout the time they knew him. The majority of interviews conducted by the defense team or FBI reflect that McVeigh had told most people at Fort Riley the same story he later told the authors of American Terrorist. He wasn't prepared, wasn't ready, not at his physical peak, and the course was just too physically demanding. Indeed, several soldiers emphasized that many of those returning from the Gulf were out of shape and had lost weight, up to 30 or 40 pounds, as much weight as was commonly lost during the SFAS itself, and added that, according to McVeigh, the CO instructed him to go back to Fort Riley, rest, and return later. On its face, the story appears plausible. In his book, Lieutenant Colonel Grossman described the physical effects of combat on soldiers. According to Grossman, the continued production of adrenaline and arousal of fight or flight responses during combat, the aggregate loss of sleep, lack of food, and weathering of the elements induce an intense and prolonged state of fatigue that begins as soon as the action stops. Grossman observed that the physiological effects of combat are very similar to the level of physical exhaustion experienced during the 8-week SFAS course, which is designed intentionally to overtax both the body and mind of recruits. SFAS hopefuls undergo a series of physical challenges including obstacle courses, 50-meter swims wearing full battle-dress uniforms, marches of more than 150 miles while carrying rifles and 50-pound rucksacks, and regular intervals of sleep and food deprivation for up to 5 days at a time. The rate of attrition is high, and over half of those who attempt SFAS do not complete the course. Although those attending the SFAS course have been selected to do so based, among other things, on their exemplary physical condition, at the conclusion of the course, many are in a state of total starvation, enhanced exhaustion, and near madness. Some even experience repeated realistic hallucinations, and most have shed over 20 pounds. In 1998, Richard Serrano wrote that McVeigh felt he should have been given more time to recuperate from the war before being sent to the tryout, and blamed the Army for his failure to pass the one test that really mattered. In fact, the majority of accounts, early and recent, contend that McVeigh's failure to make the Army's elite A-team sent him into a psychic tailspin, rendered his life a living nightmare, and initiated his descent into hell, within the depths of which he transformed from the boy next door into the demonic face of American terror. Jones team attorney Randy Coyne said that, in one sense, the Oklahoma City bombing can be attributed to a blister that ultimately left him deeply disenchanted and profoundly depressed. Initial media reports that appeared immediately after the bombing quoted and requoted a number of cohorts who said that after returning from Fort Bragg, McVeigh was angry, upset, and just not the same person they knew before. Interviews conducted by the Jones team and FBI reflected the same. One soldier with whom McVeigh briefly lived told the Jones team that his whole life shattered after he washed out of the Special Forces and had to come back and face us. It was at this time that McVeigh became noticeably disillusioned. It just got ugly. He crumbled, just fell apart. Others said McVeigh was embarrassed, angry, very upset, very disappointed, let down, and pissed off, although to what extent varied depending on who was speaking. During his interview with David Hackworth, published in the July 1995 edition of Newsweek, McVeigh denied that his failure to complete the SFAS course had any such profound effect on him, and said it wasn't the straw that broke anything. Other writers, while still keeping with lone wolf stories about the bombing, have rejected the blister theory and attribute different causes for his SFAS failure and the subsequent change in personality, including Hackworth, who thought McVeigh may have been suffering from a post-war hangover. Hackworth opined that McVeigh, mentally and physically depressed, simply gave up, like many combat veterans who stumble home without a sense of danger or purpose and lose themselves forever. Still, other versions of what occurred at the SFAS exist. On the first day of the SFAS, newly arriving recruits are administered a battery of psychological evaluations, including the SACS sentence completion tests and the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. The SFAS psychological testing was an ordeal specifically structured to put the maximum psychological pressure on those being tested. Passing the evaluation, and the SFAS itself, required that recruits demonstrate adaptability, ambition, cooperation, dependability, stamina, ingenuity, and tact under constant physical and mental stress. Note: an April 1995 research report by the Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base details some of the desirable traits looked for in Special Forces candidates. Included among these were individuals of above-average intelligence, and who tended to be assertive, self-sufficient, not extremely introverted or extroverted, not necessarily people who were emotionally stable, but who were forthright, hard to fool, and not dependent on others. The report discussed the use and function of psychological testing among the military's special operations units. The administering of these tests began in World War I. The purpose of the tests was to weed out unacceptable draftees and identify potential offenders. After World War II, the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, recognized the need to eliminate bad recruits, spies, and so established a school of psychologists and psychiatrists to develop better methods to do so. A bad recruit was, among other things, stupid, apathetic, sullen, resentful, arrogant, or insulting. Further undesirables were blabs, sloths, irritants, bad actors, and free talkers. Those whom the intelligence communities valued displayed motivation for assignment, energy and initiative, effective intelligence, emotional stability, social relations, leadership, and security. Both tests are designed to identify an individual's attitudes towards family, sex, interpersonal relationships, self-concepts, personality structures, responses to both internal and external stimuli, emotional adjustment and maturity levels, contact with reality, the ways in which conflicts are resolved, and identify possible psychological dysfunctions including hypochondria, depression, hysteria, psychosis, paranoia, obsessiveness, mania, and introversion. Included as part of the evaluation were recruits' reactions to at least 5 days of sleep deprivation. The military also uses tests like the MMPI and SSCT to construct nuanced predictive psychological profiles meant to determine placement suitability, especially those of a high-risk nature. As early as May 1995, news outlets citing unnamed military officials reported that McVeigh had failed the psychological evaluation portion of the SFAS, and once designated mentally unfit, would have been unable to try out again. A number of soldiers gave statements to the press that supported such allegations. Stickney wrote that, in 1995, he spoke with confidential source who confirmed that McVeigh was found not suitable for the Special Forces because the answers he gave on the psychological tests were apparently a bit off-center, not the answers of a man capable of long-term assignments with the exclusive and tight Special Forces. In other words, McVeigh did not fit the psychological profile. Jones told reporters that such claims were impossible because, as McVeigh left the SFAS 2 days after it began, the battery of psychological tests he took had been filed away and remained unevaluated until after his arrest. For his part, McVeigh vehemently denied allegations that he failed the SFAS psychological evaluations, and his biographers wrote that in 2000 an unnamed Army official confirmed McVeigh's denials. Note: although Stickney includes this statement from his unnamed military source about McVeigh's failure of the SFAS psychological evaluation, he also rejected the claim, based on the same reasoning as Jones. Despite the insistence of McVeigh and others to the contrary, and the denials and counter-arguments Jones floated to the press, the defense team nonetheless sought, unsuccessfully, to clarify the allegations. During their August 1995 interview with a soldier with whom McVeigh briefly lived after the Gulf War, he conceded that while McVeigh had not been in top physical shape during the SFAS, a number of the other cohorts believed he washed out on the paperwork, Fruit Loop. Rather than resolving the issue, the more the Jones team learned about the Special Forces tryout, the more questions they had. FBI records obtained by the Jones team revealed that, rather than withdrawing on April 5th, 2 days after the course began, he remained there for 5 days, from April 3rd until April 7th, 1991. Initially, when the FBI questioned SFAS Commander Captain Gore about the tryout, he said he could not recall McVeigh, but upon viewing the Army's own records presented by the FBI, he remembered that, in fact, he had personally supervised McVeigh as he filled out and signed the entrance forms on April 3rd, and the SFAS voluntary withdrawal statement on April 7th. The forum requires soldiers to explain their decision, and on his, McVeigh wrote that he was not physically ready. 4-mile rucksack march should not have hurt as much as it did. Captain Galland, who also personally approved the request, wrote on the forum that McVeigh is not physically ready, maybe having a change of heart also. Galland told agents that the 4-mile march was one of the course's earlier and easier activities, especially for someone in the physical condition that McVeigh displayed during his Army physical fitness test, and said he told McVeigh to return in 6 months and try again. Further, included among the partial records that the Jones team eventually obtained were the records of McVeigh's psychological exams, which he took on April 5, 1991, 2 days into the tryout and the day he reportedly withdrew. The military records specialist retained by the defense team noted that the results of the SSCT were of particular note, but did not elaborate. In addition, he remarked that he, for unstated reasons, was unable to evaluate the results of McVeigh's Army MMPI profile report, but Jones team mental health expert Dr. Tony Simone did, and in his subsequent memo cryptically described the results as revealing and consistent with what we are learning about Tim. The subsequent confusion about how long he had attended the SFAS, what occurred there, and the reasons he left caused his attorneys to ask in an internal memo distributed to the entire legal team, did he drop out of SF after 4 to 5 days, or did he flunk the psych exam? Their understanding of McVeigh's psychological state became even more muddled, given the combined diagnosis of the Jones team mental health experts and revelations about various incidents after he left the military. Included were recurring visits and telephone calls he made to various VA facilities in the years leading to the bombing, and claims about having been implanted with a microchip while in the Army. While the issue remained unresolved, they opined that no matter what had happened at the SFAS, his experience there had left McVeigh humiliated. Similarly, according to Stickney, the SFAS failure had devastated McVeigh, as now he would never have a chance to tell his friends and family about long-anticipated secret missions he would go on, and simply could not understand how he, the Army's model soldier, had become an outcast, unfit to perform with the best. Perhaps this explains why, both prior to and after the bombing, McVeigh told a number of conflicting stories other than the blister story about what occurred in Fort Bragg and what caused him to leave. When he arrived back at Fort Riley, McVeigh told one soldier that the SFAS had been canceled. He once told his mother, and later on one occasion his attorneys, that he became disillusioned during the SFAS when he learned the Special Forces were college book-oriented rather than field-oriented. To others, however, he painted another, much stranger portrait of events, the details of which vary slightly depending on who he told it to and when. These stories form the basis for many of the early and still circulating alternate narrative versions, and most notably those of the guilty agent and experimental variety, although, as seen in the Jones collection, McVeigh articulated variations of this story to others earlier. A letter written to his sister, Jennifer, in October 1993 best encapsulates the story he would tell in its most enduring form. McVeigh told her that his disillusionment all revolves around my arrival at Fort Bragg. The 400 new recruits had all taken a number of intelligence, psychological, adeptness, and a whole battery of other tests. Although not specifying exactly when, he said that one day SFAS officers called 10 E5 sergeants with secret clearances, including himself, out of formation, separated them from the others, and made them feel special by telling them that they had been handpicked based on their test results, intelligence, and physical makeup. After receiving a classified intelligence briefing, they were asked to volunteer for a special covert assignment in which they would act as military consultants to domestic and international civilian police and intelligence agencies. Although the exact nature and extent of this assignment remained undisclosed until they accepted the mission, it could involve a number of unsavory tasks, including drug smuggling and assassinations. In subsequent letters, he informed his sister that, while at first he played along and returned to Buffalo, where his handler made occasional contact with him, as time went by, the more he learned about his secret mission, the more distraught he became, until eventually he became suicidal and, in a near-nervous breakdown, confided the entire ordeal to his grandfather. Soon after, he decided to hit the road, go on the run, and keep my path cool in case someone is looking to shut up someone who knows too much. He acknowledged that, because of the drastic change in his personality after leaving the Army, the entire family now believed he was mentally disturbed, but assured her this was an act, all part of the game. He asked her to keep what he disclosed to herself, and warned that if she betrayed his confidence, his life could be in danger. He apologized if what he told her had fucked her up, but said that he had an urgent need for someone in the family to understand me, and needed someone to know in case I'm found floating in a river. In this story, arguably among the stranger ones to circulate, McVeigh does not leave the Special Forces tryout because he is unfit, either physically or mentally, but rather, based on his superior mental and physical qualities, becomes part of a covert group acting independently from the Army or other government oversight. Out of principle and personal conviction, though, he goes rogue and is forced to go into hiding and live on the run because of the secret knowledge he learned. Whether told in deception or delusion, or true, partially true, or wholly fabricated, McVeigh's stories sound similar to the popular 1980s television series The A-Team, the crack commando unit framed for a bank robbery and, having escaped, must live underground on the run and hunted by the Army. His defense team was unable to make heads or tails of such claims, but did not think they had been written disingenuously, and Jones team attorney Rob Nye, referring to the letters, noted, "If Tim is lying, he's one good liar." McVeigh later explained to his biographers that he fabricated the entire story based on news reports about just such scenarios and had done so in order to introduce his sister to his mindset at the time and illustrate his distrust of the government. He emphasized, however, that the story in the letter was completely plausible and within the realm of possibilities as these things go. Herbeck and Michelle wrote that because 19-year-old Jennifer was impressionable, she believed her brother's fairy tale, was certain something terrible had happened in the military, and figured someone in the military had deceived her brother, and when he learned the truth, it had changed him forever. His biographers conclude this discussion by opining that McVeigh's rambling letter to his sister conjured up a fantastic scenario to justify his outrage and disappointment. Indicative of other lone wolf and most pack accounts, the authors say nothing more about the strange letter, which in their book exists as the only acknowledgement of any alternate account offered by McVeigh about the SFAS. Over the years, various writers have likewise briefly touched on and then summarily dismissed the claims McVeigh made in the letter as expressions of his fantastical imagination and further evidence of his deceptiveness and manipulations. Like the psych test story, however, other published works, in combination with oral and archival documentation, offer the possibility of a number of conflicting but parallel readings of McVeigh's Special Forces stint and subsequent downward spiral. Even if McVeigh made up the story, his mother and sister seemed to believe it, as evidenced by FBI recordings of their conversations obtained through bugs hidden in a motel room furnished by the FBI for their protection shortly after McVeigh's arrest, as well as telephone wiretaps of the McVeigh family's incoming and outgoing phone calls. In one such conversation that occurred just days after his arrest, Jennifer spoke with her mother about how heavily the entire Special Forces ordeal had weighed on her brother, so much so that it led him to consider suicide, but ultimately he had simply refused to carry out his orders, thereby making himself a target. Mickey's responses to Jennifer during the conversation indicated that she had heard parts of this story from her son previously. Jennifer then went on to express her growing frustration with the FBI because, she explained, the agents continued to deny that her brother had actually been accepted into the Special Forces, fortuitously adding that, although she provided the FBI with records that proved it, she feared that they had destroyed them. Finally, McVeigh told another particularly intriguing version of this story during his first meeting with John Coyle and Susan Otto, the public defenders originally appointed to represent him. To them, he said, he had been operating within the confines of the United States government when he did what he did, having been recruited by the government while serving a 4 to 5 month period in the National Guard. His duties were to search for neo-Nazis and other problem troops within the National Guard. The operation had gone well, and eventually his handlers instructed him to participate in a brewing plot to bomb the Murrah, but to make sure the bomb only blew out a few windows of the building. He now suspected someone had switched either the truck or the explosive in it without his knowledge. Otto and Coyle, both of whom had offices in Oklahoma City, subsequently recused themselves from the case, citing conflicts of interest. Note: while Jones does not discuss McVeigh's strange claims to Otto and Coyle, he did write that after he was appointed to the case, Otto cryptically warned him, "When you know everything I know, Stephen, and you will soon enough, you will never think of the United States of America in the same way again." When the Jones team asked McVeigh about what he had told Otto and Coyle, McVeigh became very angry and began yelling and cursing, exclaiming that Coyle had no business discussing their private conversations with anyone, and that while some parts of this story were true, some were not. For the remainder of his life, McVeigh continued to both affirm and deny to the Jones team and others the covert operation story, telling it a bit differently each time. While on death row in Terre Haute, Indiana, McVeigh met David Paul Hammer, another prisoner awaiting execution. In 2004, after McVeigh's execution, Hammer published his first book, Secrets Worth Dying For, Timothy James McVeigh and the Oklahoma City Bombing, based on alleged conversations between the two, followed by an updated version, Deadly Secrets, in 2010. According to Hammer, McVeigh told him a remarkable story. While at the SFAS, McVeigh encountered a high-ranking official whom he referred to only as the Major, a man he said had befriended him during the Gulf War. The Major, who McVeigh said was dressed in civilian clothing and had an unkempt appearance in general, pulled him aside and told him he was currently working for the Department of Defense on ultra-secret need-to-know Black Ops, whose agenda was primarily domestic intelligence gathering and internal threat evaluations with an emphasis on direct counteraction operations. The Major then described a right-wing militancy spreading rapidly throughout the United States that threatened to rip the country apart. He offered McVeigh a position in a secret unit, adding that he would be working alone for the most part, but could recruit people of his own choosing as needed. When he accepted, the Major instructed McVeigh to wash out of the Special Forces, tone down his hotshot performance in the Army, and quit the Army altogether by the end of the year. In the meantime, in order to infiltrate the far right-wing paramilitary underground, McVeigh was to become familiar with the rhetoric and literature of the extreme right, create a plausible aura of a disgruntled soldier, and await further instructions. McVeigh obeyed the orders and began immersing himself in right-wing literature, something that came easy to him because, Hammer said, of the beliefs and knowledge that already existed inside him. Eventually, the major instructed McVeigh to participate in the bombing. Hammer said, true or not, McVeigh believed the story, and in the final days of his life, became preoccupied by the idea that somehow, through one ruse or another, the major would prevent his execution at the last minute, perhaps by faking it, and he would be given reconstructive surgery, sent away, and rewarded for his service. For obvious reasons, it is easy to dismiss this as a fantastical tale woven by Hammer, a desperate death row inmate. In fact, prior to his execution, McVeigh expressed his dislike of Hammer and warned more than one person that after his death, Hammer would publish a book, which McVeigh said would be full of lies. While Hammer's account must be read with a healthy dose of skepticism, it relayed details of conversations and claims McVeigh made in private, some prior to the bombing, that were not known publicly, and therefore could not have been known by Hammer unless McVeigh told him. For instance, although attributing the SFAS withdrawal to McVeigh's blister, Randy Coyne, who continued as one of McVeigh's lawyers until his execution, relayed a story McVeigh sometimes told, which Coyne referred to as the Bourne scenario, alluding to the recent popular movie series about Jason Bourne, a rogue former CIA agent, released only after McVeigh's execution. The books came earlier. Coyne explained that, until his dying day, McVeigh entertained the idea that rather than being executed, his former handlers might intervene, whisk him away, and reward him for completing his mission and keeping his mouth shut. Note: McVeigh mentioned David Paul Hammer in at least 16 letters he wrote to his biographers, in most of them expressing his distrust and dislike of Hammer. In 2007, Terry Nichols signed an affidavit stating that prior to the bombing, McVeigh confided that a high-ranking FBI agent had recruited him to participate in undercover operations and at some point had instructed McVeigh to participate in the bombing. Nichols said McVeigh became visibly enraged during their conversation and ranted about how his handler changed the original target of the planned bombing, directing him to bomb the Murrah instead. While the court sealed Nichols' 2007 affidavit and supporting documents, in them he disclosed the identities of other alleged government informants and conspirators within the bombing plot, and wrote that they were being protected by the FBI/government in a cover-up to escape its responsibility for the loss of life in Oklahoma. Note: Nichols, no longer able to appeal his guilty verdict or sentence, said in his affidavit that the purpose of his 2007 disclosures were intended to help the victims find closure. With the exception of the letters to his sister, which became known to the public early on, and without knowing how often McVeigh told such stories, who he told them to, or that he told them at all, various commentators have advanced several possible scenarios. In his 1998 book purporting various conspiracy theories or alternate narratives about McVeigh and the bombing, David Hoffman considers some possible explanations for the appearance of what he calls the two McVeighs. Hoffman suggests that perhaps someone working for the government had duped McVeigh into believing a false cover story that he was on an important top-secret mission, and his indifference to his arrest may simply have been indicative of his understanding that he was working for a government agency. Thus, McVeigh was telling his sister the truth about his induction into a covert operation and had been sheep-dipped and ordered to play the part of a disgruntled ex-military man. McVeigh then carried out the bombing as part of this mission, or alternately became disenchanted, refused, and therefore was targeted for termination by setting him up as a fall guy, which Hoffman adds is standard protocol for those who try to break from the shadowy world of deep intelligence. Note: to explain the term sheep-dipped, Hoffman quotes former CIA DoD liaison L. Fletcher Prudy's book, The Secret Team. Prudy wrote that sheep-dipping is an intricate Army-devised process by which a man who is in the service as a full-career soldier or officer agrees to go through all the legal and official motions of resigning from the service. Then, rather than actually being released, his records are pulled from the Army personnel files and transferred to a special Army intelligence file. Substitute but nonetheless real-appearing records are then processed, and the man leaves the service. A Noble Lie, Coming Home. After McVeigh's brief and mysterious SFAS tryout at Fort Bragg, he returned home to the Buffalo area several times on leave. Friends and family members immediately noticed changes in his personality, and, as reflected in the Jones team's interviews with them, attributed it to his experiences in the Gulf War, rather than the failed Special Forces tryout. It seemed he had a vision of himself irreconcilable with what he saw and did in the Gulf, and was now cognizant of things his friends and family back home could never understand. Even his official biographers, Herbeck and Michelle, came to feel that, much more than his failure to make Special Forces, his experience in the war had soured him on the military. The more he thought about it, the worse he felt about the killing he had done for the American government, and stressed that the real reason for his disillusionment was the lies he heard in the Persian Gulf. When he saw Steve Hodge after returning from the Gulf War, McVeigh emphasized that he had not done anything heroic during the war and called the medals and commendations here overblown. To Steve, Tim seemed greatly troubled by what occurred during the war and described it as a waste of life due to the inability of the Iraqis to fight. When he did have to fight, McVeigh said, the fighting had been terrible. He told Steve about the friendly fire, the people he killed, and the murdering of surrendering Iraqis, who, McVeigh said, would pop down in their trenches, wait for the firing to stop, pop back up, and continue their attempts to surrender. It seemed like a cycle to Tim, and Steve could tell it bothered him a lot. He said, "I think seeing people suffer hurt him, and he had had his fill of fighting." Although he had always wanted to help people, to play the hero, Steve reflected that when the war ended, Tim turned his attention to pointing out the injustices in the world. His maternal cousin and godmother told the Jones team that McVeigh appeared bitter and disappointed. "I think he tried to be a good soldier. He wanted to be number one, but his experiences during the war had a negative effect on him." His aunt said she could tell immediately that it had been an overwhelming experience for him. To her he confided, "I had never known death before. I saw bodies laying around. After a while it began to get easier. It didn't hurt as much." Jennifer noticed that her brother was more restless, nervous, and appeared confused. His mother also observed a change in him. He told her about having to kill Iraqis and how bad he felt about it. She later said, "He did what he had to do, but it hurt him." Former neighbors Dan and Linda Dangler, names changed, recalled he was somber as he recounted to them, witnessing death and shooting people. They noted that when he did talk about it, he seemed odd, straight-faced. He didn't have much emotion, as if it was hard for him to remember. Mrs. McDermott, his former neighbor, could tell the war deeply affected him, especially the starving Iraqi children. Similarly, she observed a stark difference in the way he spoke of his general experiences in the Gulf, as opposed to those involving combat, and recounted one conversation they had over dinner. Tim talked about the war as if he was numb. There was no emotion in his voice as he described an incident where their jeep had gotten stuck in the sand and some Iraqis came out and got them out and then surrendered to them. He talked as if he was pulled away from it all, as if he was there but not there. That's the way he was when he talked about anything to do with fighting or the Iraqis, but when he talked about things that had happened in the barracks, he was his usual self, the old Tim we knew. It was eerie. According to Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, the intensity, trauma, and guilt soldiers suffer post-combat inevitably result in a web of forgetfulness, deception, and lies. This traumatic personal matrix reflects cultural and institutional practices of forgetting inconvenient truths, and is exacerbated by the eventual understanding that history is written by victors. This, combined with the soldiers' simultaneous yet unconscious cover-up of the reality of their own combat actions, results in a larger socio-cultural conspiracy of silence about the realities of war. Particularly difficult is the impact of realizing one's participation in unjust killing and wartime atrocities, an epiphany that wreaks havoc on a soldier's indoctrinated belief that, while violent, the actions taken on the battlefield are nonetheless noble. This is especially so for witnesses or participants in the killing of surrendering or captured enemy troops or civilians who develop a deep, lingering, and unresolvable need to justify such actions. Although Grossman wrote very shortly after the conclusion of the Gulf War, he failed to mention incidents like the bulldozer assault or the mass killing on Basra Highway. But he might as well have been writing specifically about them, as well as McVeigh's own responses to them when, while discussing wartime atrocities, Grossman remarked, "Killing comes with a price, and societies must learn that their soldiers will have to spend the rest of their lives living with what they have done. Mass murder and execution can be sources of mass empowerment. Each soldier who actively or passively participated in mass executions is faced with a stark choice. The soldier can resist the incredibly powerful array of forces that call for him to kill, or can bow before the social and psychological forces that demand that he kill, and in doing so he will be strangely empowered. He must believe that not only is this atrocity right, but it is proof that he is morally, socially, and culturally superior to those whom he has killed. It is the ultimate act of denial of their humanity. His mental health is totally invested in believing that what he has done is good and right. The worst part is that when you institute and execute a policy of atrocity, you and your society must live with what you have done." The Ill Political Anti-McVeigh. By the time McVeigh returned to Fort Riley in May 1991, the majority of his original cohorts and Gulf War buddies had fulfilled their enlistment obligations and left the Army. Perhaps not knowing what else to do, McVeigh re-enlisted on May 21, 1991, and served one final year before also deciding to leave active duty service. Throughout the summer of 1991, he lived off-base in an apartment with two other soldiers, Sergeant Richard Cerny and Corporal John Kelso, who said they quickly became offended at the way he spoke ill of his mother and were frightened by his erratic driving habits. Kelso remarked to the Jones team that, to him, it seemed McVeigh had no respect for laws and described his memories of this time. McVeigh was a nice guy, but had different views than most people and didn't act normal like Cerny and I did. He was real serious and read a lot. He was a loner who just wanted to be by himself. He'd rather sit in his room and read books than do what we were doing. Sometimes he'd hang out with Fortier. Me and Cerny were different than him. We drank and chased women, and he was really a private kind of person. We stayed up all night and went to work, but McVeigh was totally opposite. Hell, he never had a girlfriend in his life that I knew of. Never used drugs. Just Mr. Clean. I would see him drink some, but it was a minor amount. He drank more after the Gulf. He had a lot of guns, and I found it unusual. I'm a hunter, and I hunt a lot, and I've got guns for every type of hunting. Ducks, deer, geese. But he wasn't a hunter at all and still had a ton of guns. His were more for self-protection. He was a shooter. He shot a lot with anybody. Anybody that wanted to go out, he always went. There was a big change in him when we got back from the Gulf. When he didn't get into Special Forces, his whole dream shattered. He had to come back and face us. No one was really harassing him about it, but he knew that we knew. I think he thought we saw him as a failure. He had no other thing on his mind before except the special forces and military, and after that he just crumbled. It was 100% change. Cerny, who had been in the Gulf with McVeigh during the war, often in the Bradley next to his, was less kind in his assessment. For one thing, Cerny explained, McVeigh was the most racist bastard I ever knew. During the war, he had personally witnessed McVeigh shooting at surrendering Iraqis, and even at that time thought that shooting people didn't bother him in any way. In fact, he continued, Cerny said he personally believed that, if it came down to it, McVeigh would not hesitate to shoot them too, adding that McVeigh is a cold-blooded bastard who believes that life is very cheap. Both Cerny and Kelso said that after the war, McVeigh had a bad attitude, kept guns around him at all times, and seemed paranoid. They even sometimes joked that one day they would see McVeigh's face on a wanted poster, a foresight shared by many others prior to his arrest. Reflective of Cerny and Kelso's impressions were 6 letters McVeigh wrote to Steve while living with them. In one, dated July 10, 1991, he promised to show Steve his pictures from the war next time he came home, but then went on to admonish Steve for not sending information he requested, specifically the contact information for Handgun Control, Inc., a gun control advocacy group formed by Sarah Brady to have the Brady Bill legislation passed. To Steve he wrote, I asked you about an address for Sarah Brady or HCI, so I can mail bomb her. McVeigh, who had never lived in a civilian space with anyone but his family, began to feel his roommates were too nosy and decided to leave. His friend, Sergeant Royal Witcher, lived off base in the nearby town of Harrington, Kansas, and since the two had always gotten along, in September 1991, when McVeigh asked if he could move in, Witcher agreed. Witcher recalled his increasingly odd personal life and described in detail how McVeigh kept almost no furniture in his room, hanging a poncho instead of a curtain on the windows, and, like a child, had Garfield the cat blankets and sheets. McVeigh, said Witcher, was extremely shy and unable to express himself to women, and so never had a date. According to Mark Ham, Witcher now lived with the spokesperson for Paranoia itself. During this time, just as before the war, McVeigh continued to excel as a soldier at Fort Riley, at least in the eyes of his superiors. At the end of September, he received his 2nd Army Commendation Medal, scored perfect in a competition, earned the distinction of top Bradley gunner, and once again became the evaluator for the new Bradley training course. For McVeigh, though, things were different, and he no longer derived pleasure from such accolades. Other soldiers noticed an unspoken change, a definite difference in Tim's attitude. He didn't seem to care anymore and was pretty disillusioned with the military. He wasn't as motivated and didn't have the drive that he always had. He was hyper, nervous, bitter, angry, reclusive, and isolated. He occasionally expressed remorse about the people he killed in Iraq, and his political rhetoric became notably more dramatic and aggressive. They were unsure, however, if these changes were a reaction to the war or to his failure at the SFAS course. To fellow soldier Sheffield Anderson, McVeigh spoke of returning home to upstate New York, building a bunker on his land, and loading it with food, weapons, and ammunition so that he could be ready if the apocalypse hit. Steve Hodge told the Jones team that McVeigh's characteristic obsessiveness towards his interests had always mutated from one form to another, but after the war, his 2 most persistent ones, guns and survivalism, merged with his increasing critiques of the U.S. government's corruption. According to another soldier, McVeigh became real bitter about everything. He read lots of books about the JFK assassination and believed it was a conspiracy. He also began delving into and heatedly discussing books about the U.S. government's private armies and railed continuously about how the CIA, FBI, and big business were getting out of control. About this period, Stickney wrote that McVeigh was scared and mad and getting madder. So much so that some of the other soldiers who previously had at least some respect for him began calling him anti-McVeigh because he seemed to be anti-everything. Another soldier said McVeigh was always strange, but rapidly became stranger. He related an incident that occurred one night while they were out driving around, during which McVeigh suddenly parked on the side of the road, pulled out his pistol, and just started rapid firing into the open field. McVeigh said he hadn't done that in a while, so he just felt like he had to do that. I thought he probably went off the deep end. His new roommate Witcher, with whom McVeigh got along well, said the strangest thing he noticed was that McVeigh kept weapons all over the house, in the bathroom, behind the towels, the kitchen cupboards, under the couch in the living room, in the ledge over the stairs, and his car, both in the glove box and trunk. Other guns, Witcher continued, he stashed at friends' houses, but McVeigh's personal armory soon grew so large that he had to rent a storage locker in nearby Junction City. I don't know if he was paranoid or what, or maybe he had some friends that were after him. I don't know. McVeigh began spending more time with Terry Nichols, who lived nearby, and frequently made trips to Michigan to hang out with Terry's brother, James. McVeigh, Witcher continued, became ill political. Amidst his obsessive consumption of news, McVeigh found at least one thing to take issue with every day. Another cohort said he noticed that once McVeigh began spending more time with the civilian population around the base, with whom he shared similar interests and sometimes went out shooting, he became a little more closed-mouthed. Some commentators suspect that McVeigh might have first become acquainted with members of the rapidly growing Patriot and militia movements during this time. In 1990, Larry Pratt, the father of the modern militia movement and executive director of Gun Owners of America, an anti-gun control legislation organization, published his manifesto that called for the formation of armed civilian militias and civil defense units, and warned of the federal government's plan to disarm Americans. Reflective of a growing trend throughout the country, citizens' militias, paramilitary, and anti-government groups had begun to appear around the Fort Riley area and in Michigan, where McVeigh spent an increasing amount of time. Economic and social disenfranchisement, rooted in part from the 1980s farm crisis, gun control legislation, increased militarization of police, NAFTA, and the military's involvement in United Nations peacekeeping operations, were all indicative of Bush's New World Order, which provoked fears that the U.S. Constitution was rapidly eroding and the country was losing its sovereignty. Oppositional right-wing groups within the increasingly popular umbrella of the Patriot movement responded by stepping up their recruitment and propaganda efforts, targeting, among others, active-duty military personnel who were attracted to their patriotic, anti-communist, constitutional rhetoric, combined with their professed willingness to take up arms against the corrupt government. The presence of militia, patriot, and other anti-government paramilitary groups was strongest in states with higher numbers of gun owners and Vietnam and Gulf War combat veterans, including the Fort Riley area, where recruitment efforts directed at soldiers were becoming more noticeable. McVeigh claimed he was never a card-carrying member of any group, but clearly their pro-gun message and paranoid outlook appealed to him. Despite such claims, McVeigh at different times in his life was in fact a card-carrying member of the KKK, the NRA, the Republican Party, and of course the U.S. Army. The atmosphere at Fort Riley following the period immediately after the Gulf War was markedly desperate. Soldier morale was low, and many considered their posting at Fort Riley as a career-ender, due in part to the increased budget cuts and downsizing. Suicides and murder rates at the base continued to increase. Many shared the growing feeling that the government had left them by the wayside. Army intelligence officials noted that the growing number of disgruntled soldiers at Fort Riley offered extremist ideologues a chance to expand their ranks. The commander of the Kansas Citizen Militia agreed, admitting his group specifically recruited military personnel, explaining, "These young men go into the military for all the right reasons, to protect the country, but they are watching themselves being turned into policemen for the wealthy interests of the few. They know it, we know it, that's why they're coming to us." In the updated 1995 edition of their book, Snapping, Conway and Siegelman described various ways in which political indoctrination acts as an information disease, and argued that when a person who, for whatever reason, including trauma, has become physically and mentally wrecked, they consume information less critically and are more open to manipulation by others. They then offer McVeigh and his developing anti-government ideologies as an example of how information diseases lead to snapping. According to them, many of the Patriot and militia cells used cult-like methods, including covert recruitment and induction, intimate group dynamics, and ritualized indoctrination, as well as more serious communication pathologies that they say played a factor in the Oklahoma City bombing. The extremist movement's distorted beliefs, ideas, and potentially lethal information inundated talk and shortwave radio and computer networks, appealing to the disenfranchised, like McVeigh and Nichols, who wanted to reduce the complexities of modern society and the new global communication culture that ultimately gave rise to new forms of mental illness and mass insanity. In 1999, cultural commentator Peter Knight also observed the rapid spread of alternative information during this period, largely through underground presses, talk radio, cable television shows, fax networks, home publishing, and the emerging internet. Knight felt, however, that the general distrust of the government expressed and proliferated among ultra-conservatives did not necessarily indicate the recrudescence of a paranoia virus whose victims unthinkingly fall prey to the types of insanity discussed by Conway and Siegelman. Rather, it indicated a massive shift of these beliefs from the fringes to the mainstream, across both the right and left-wing spectrums, that had resulted from decades of revelations about government corruption, cover-ups, and conspiracies, as well as the profound economic and social restructuring resulting from the rise of global free-market capitalism. In fact, Knight continued, a crisis of legitimacy permeated throughout the U.S., and seemingly right-wing scaremongering rants about Bush's supposed plans for a new world order were perhaps not so far from what we might normally think of as leftist commentary. Given that, sorting out the left from the right and plausible from implausible becomes virtually impossible. For Knight, Timothy McVeigh suffered from just this type of legitimacy crisis, but ultimately represented one that existed beyond the confines of the hardcore militia. In addition to the growing presence of the Patriot movement, racial tensions that has long existed at Fort Riley were reaching a boiling point, and organized racism within the military was gaining the attention of watchdog groups and law enforcement officials. White power organizations were engaged in their own recruitment of military personnel. McVeigh's rhetoric and behavior reflected all of this. Ivory Trone, an African-American soldier, was just out of boot camp when McVeigh became his squad leader. To the Jones team, he described the men McVeigh hung out with as the Redneck Posse, and on a number of occasions heard them use racial affronts to blacks and other non-white races. He and McVeigh had a falling out when McVeigh issued an order and Trone talked back. McVeigh took him outside and chewed him out, threatening his career in the U.S. Army. He didn't like people questioning his authority. Trone said that was the point when he realized McVeigh was very biased and prejudiced, and judged him on the color of his skin and not on his merit as a soldier. McVeigh did not like most of the new soldiers arriving at Fort Riley and told his biographers that during his final months in the Army, his overt racism resurfaced, attributing this to the disrespectful attitudes of new black kids coming into his unit. You don't like your squad leader because he makes you get up at 5 a.m. It's a basic human trait in the Army. These guys turned it into a racial thing. They didn't understand that they were privates. Hence, when he noticed black soldiers wearing Black Power t-shirts around base, he ordered one that said White Power from the back of a survivalist magazine. To order the shirt, he had to send a $20 membership fee to the North Carolina Ku Klux Klan. He did not feel the shirt was offensive, since black guys were wearing Black Power t-shirts on the base, and they weren't supposed to. I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted to make a point. Back in the 60s, people would bring communist manifestos onto campus. Does that mean they're a communist because they bought that book and read it? In his exhaustive book on the history of the international white power movement, The Beast Awakens, Martin E. Lee wrote that the majority of right-wing paramilitary groups had intimate personal and ideological connections to white supremacist groups. Lee explained in great depth how the white power movement had embarked upon a systematic attempt to tone down their racial rhetoric and gain more mainstream credibility in order to attract unsuspecting, susceptible, and disgruntled individuals drawn to the ideas and concepts of the militias. Quote, although hardcore racialists, that is to say, those who consciously embrace racism as an ideology, remained a numerical minority, they were the motor that propelled and guided militia movement since its inception. Indeed, McVeigh claimed his curiosity about the Patriot community and basic fundamental rights led him to books like the Turner Diaries, which in turn led him to explore organizations like the National Alliance and the KKK. However, the real test of his racism, he said, was his eventual determination, based on his moral values, that white power movement literature and propaganda manipulated young people by falsely equating racism with patriotism. Therefore, he explained, after becoming very unhappy with the Klan, he let his membership expire and later traded the t-shirt for ammunition and smoke grenades. Note, McVeigh would later change his mind concerning the KKK at this time in his life, as later he would make contact with and request an application for another KKK chapter in Arkansas. Still, McVeigh resumed his peculiar habit of reading, rereading, and handing out copies of the Turner Diaries, and had one on hand at all times, like a Baptist with his Bible. Later, both he and Stephen Jones rejected an insanity defense because, as Jones stated, his client did not wish to be depicted as another John Hinckley. Yet McVeigh's obsession with the Turner Diaries and other popular culture works certainly evoked Hinckley, as well as other bibliophile lone wolf assassins like Mark David Chapman, both of whom had a similar obsession with The Catcher in the Rye. Interestingly, Hinckley had provoked the Brady gun control legislation that ironically helped provoke the Oklahoma City bombing, which then prompted further debates about people like McVeigh. McVeigh wrote to his attorneys, I think that the Turner Diaries, at least the first 100 pages, should be required reading for everyone on the defense team, because the truth is, it is a blueprint. It wasn't my specific blueprint, but it provides a good tactical and philosophical outline, minus the racial thing. He downplayed his racism a couple of years later, telling his biographers that he identified not with Turner's racism, but with the book's underlying message about gun rights and individual freedom. The Turner Diaries, he insisted, was not so much the blueprint for the bombing, but rather provided an inspirational model of resistance to gun control legislation. Despite his disenchantment, accusations of his racism, his increasingly apparent bad attitude and strange politics, his superiors still considered him an excellent soldier. But no amount of commendations, accolades, medals, or promotions could mitigate the lies he heard in the Persian Gulf, or the abortive Special Forces experience. The more he thought about it, wrote Herbeck and Michelle, the worse he felt about the killing he had done for the American government, and he no longer wanted to work for the government he was beginning to hate. Thus, in late 1991, when his battalion commander asked McVeigh to be his personal driver, he declined, and with his eyes welling up with tears, announced he was leaving the Army. Note, the incident was the second known time in his adult life that Tim McVeigh cried in front of someone, the first being when he thought he was about to die just prior to leaving for the Persian Gulf. Later, several Jones team members realized his eyes often welled up with tears when he talked about Waco, but maintained his coldness when speaking of his own victims. McVeigh said later that while the position of personal driver would have been less demanding, it entailed more paperwork than he was willing to deal with, and would have required him to rub noses with officers, whom he considered the Army's politicians. Instead, on December 31, 1991, he submitted his letter of resignation to his CO. His decision surprised his cohorts, many of whom thought that, of all people, McVeigh would be a career soldier, regardless of the new military cutbacks. Further, nobody expected he would pass up the chance to attend the SFAS again, only months away. Now nobody was quite sure what he would do or where he would go. A primary reason for the creation and circulation of conflicting stories about Timothy McVeigh was the little-known fact that McVeigh himself authored or told them first, and like the SFAS failure, he gave different explanations to different people about his decision to leave the Army. Gordon Blackcloud recalled that He wasn't the cheerful guy he was before, but he didn't really say too much or focused on what he was planning on doing. First Sergeant Bob Harris tried to talk him out of it, but his mind was set. Hartley had the impression he was going home to attend college, but McVeigh told Dan Stroud he planned to go home and become a law enforcement officer. Royal Witcher also saw him just before he left. McVeigh told Witcher and another soldier, Maurice Ray, he was going to disappear for quite a while and wouldn't even be able to tell his parents where he would be or what he would be doing. And that, indeed, is exactly what he went on to do. Witcher recalled that both he and Ray thought it was kind of funny and strange at the same time. We thought it was just Tim being strange. He was always a little strange, but we couldn't figure out what he had gotten himself into that he couldn't tell his parents about. Alan Smith recalled, he changed over time after he got back from the war. His temper had gotten worse. McVeigh told Smith he'd had enough of the political BS that goes along with the Army, had lost interest, and just wanted to turn his back. He was so fed up he just got out. Tim really hated it along toward the end. And another said, the day he got out of the Army, he spent his last night at my house. I don't think he was bitter as much as he just didn't know what he was going to do. I know he told me he was lost. Stress level 3,000%. If McVeigh dropped out of his Special Forces tryout because he was in bad physical shape, as he claimed, he appeared to recover quickly. According to one of the soldiers who had joined Charlie Company immediately after the Gulf War, Sergeant McVeigh was very gung-ho. He was a good runner, maintained his physical fitness, found pleasure in pushing himself physically. He enjoyed pushing others, especially in the 60-pound rucksack marches, which had supposedly given him so much trouble at Fort Bragg. When most started to get tired, he continued, McVeigh found pleasure in pushing himself and others. Yet there was something else going on, something unexplored in all published accounts that may provide clues and context about his decision to leave the Army. Absent in the many letters McVeigh wrote Steve, as well as in the transcripts of FBI and defense team interviews with other soldiers, is any mention of his continued medical visits. From the time he returned from the Gulf in April until leaving the Army in December, he continued his secret life as a professional patient. Inexplicably, while large portions of McVeigh's military medical records are found in the Jones collection, no memoranda or correspondence were located in the collection, indicating that anybody on the Jones team noticed or discussed the frequency of his medical visits while in the Army. It is no wonder that Cerny and Kelso found McVeigh a bit cranky, as during the summer of 1991, while living with them, McVeigh visited the dentist several times. On June 20th, 1991, 2 of his teeth were decaying and causing him pain. On July 1st, 12th, 15th, and 29th, he returned for medical attention on at least 7 different teeth. Doctors noted he had small protruding pieces of bone sticking out in his mouth, which was infected, and the bone chips caused him continuous pain. In the midst of this, on July 17th, he saw a doctor for the removal of moles that had recently appeared on his chin and near his ear. At the end of the summer, on August 26, 1991, at 1 p.m., just prior to moving out of the apartment he shared with Cerny and Kelso, McVeigh visited the doctor, saying he was nauseated, unable to hold fluids, and could not stop vomiting. He did not have a fever. Note: the first appearance of medical attention McVeigh received since returning from the Gulf occurred on June 20th, 1991, when he visited the dentist because 2 of his teeth were decaying and were causing him pain. Soon after, on July 1st, he returned on the 12th, 15th, and 29th of that month, with attention being given to at least 7 different teeth. On the 15th, he reported that there were small pieces of bone sticking out, he was in pain, and his mouth was infected. He complained of bone chips and continued pain again on the 29th of that month. In September 1991, the month he moved in with Royal Witcher, McVeigh received another typhoid vaccination. An almost unreadable document stamped Emergency Treatment Center, Fort Riley, shows that sometime in October 1991, the 23-year-old combat veteran received a medical injection of an unknown variety after seeking medical care for unknown reasons. On October 14th, he complained of pain in his right shoulder, but the radiologist, after examining results of the x-rays he ordered, found no significant abnormalities. Meanwhile, McVeigh attended Fort Irwin's National Training Center, located in the Mojave Desert of San Bernardino County, California, and arrived back at Fort Riley on October 20th. 2 days later, on October 22nd, at 6 a.m., doctors at Fort Riley saw him for a previously diagnosed ulcer as well as a cold that had persisted since the week before. On October 28th, 1991, he wrote to Steve, "At 16:30 hours formation, they told us that we would be on alert as of 04:30 tomorrow morning. Our bags will be packed into a semi. We're on alert to guard a nuclear site in Utah against terrorist attacks. Great, another opportunity for my balls to fall off." He had a stress level of 3,000. He closed by saying, "I have to quit now. I have a pounding headache." He did not mention the recent visits to the doctor. An NCO evaluation report detailing his performance from February until November 1991 recommended his promotion to a higher pay grade. A little over a week later, at 6 a.m. on November 7, 1991, he sought medical attention, saying that for the previous 4 weeks his left big toe had been deteriorating. It was scaling, fissuring between toes, red, and itching. He told the doctor that the skin scales, then grows back, then holes appear. At 5:30 a.m. on November 13th, he again went to the medical unit, this time complaining about facial moles located above the chin, but below the bottom lip, and on the right side of his face near his ear, that interfered with shaving and requested that they be removed. On a separate form entitled Request for Civilian Medical Care, the doctor described the skin tags and noted two new moles, the first 5mm flesh-colored, and the second 2mm raised flesh-colored. The previous July, and in the civilian medical referral, the doctor wrote the moles were new, but in a November 13th report, they had been there his entire lifetime. McVeigh arrived at the dentist again on November 20th, 1991, and because of his bleeding gums, doctors ordered an x-ray. By this time, he had received so many x-rays that fears of his testicles falling off appear reasonable. By the time he left Fort Riley, only 5 of his teeth remained untouched. The November 20th dental visit was the last to appear on his military medical records, but, as will be seen, this was certainly not his last visit. After leaving the Army, McVeigh continued to visit private dentists throughout the country, including just days before the bombing. Often these visits occurred in mysterious circumstances. In a radiological request report dated December 5, 1991, the attending doctor noted McVeigh's upper gastrointestinal difficulties that included his retention of gaseous secretions and the possibility of duodenitis, an inflammation of the intestine, commonly caused by viral infection, bacteria, and often resulting in an ulcer. James Rockwell, the supply sergeant for Charlie Company, said that one day McVeigh entered the Fort Riley supply room and confided his belief that he had a computer chip in his backside. Rockwell was not sure what McVeigh meant by this and asked him to explain. McVeigh responded that the military had done things to him and said, "I think they've brainwashed me or injected me with something." At the very least, Rockwell opined, McVeigh felt the Army had manipulated him into killing innocent Iraqis. On December 10th, McVeigh put in to get out of the Army and received an honorable discharge effective December 31st, 1991. The reason noted for his separation, the early transition program, for the convenience of the government. As part of his early discharge, he enlisted or accepted a voluntary assignment in the New York State Army National Guard based in Tonawanda, New York, to begin immediately upon leaving Fort Riley. The same day, December 10th, he wrote Steve, "Yeah, I'll be home for Christmas, but in a way you never imagined. That's right, roll out the red carpet, hold all calls, because the kid is coming home. Know of any job openings for a washed-up war hero? See you by the 20th. I'll need help unloading the U-Haul." The next day, on December 11th, 1991, he was administered anesthesia for the removal of the pesky moles, which did or did not recently appear. The doctor appears to have taken no tissue specimens to the lab for further testing. Like so many aspects of his life, details about his health are conflicting and contradictory. McVeigh told his attorneys that he once had a negative incident with a captain during a drill when the captain chewed him out for visiting the medic for an ingrown toenail. Woody Davis said McVeigh had sinus problems before he left Fort Riley. Gordon Blackcloud explained the standard protocol for obtaining medical attention. If you wanted to see the doctor, you had to go through the chain of command. You had to see the medic first. After I told him about McVeigh's records and asked him what he thought, he said that if he was sick as the records reflected, someone would have noticed, and the other soldiers would have given him a hard time. "We spent the whole time together as one unit, from basic to the whole deal," Blackcloud elaborated. "I don't know how he was before he came in, but he seemed to be in good health. As many times as he went to the doctor, that's what I'm sitting here trying to figure out as well, too. It seemed like he would have gotten in trouble for it being too excessive." The loquacious Ray Barnes provided the following explanation. "He didn't have any health problems that I knew of. I think he had trouble in his feet one time, but that was when he was doing a lot of road marching and getting ready for the Special Forces. When you start marching a lot of miles, you gotta take care of your feet. If they break down. I heard he hurt his leg in trying out, and that's about the only big major health thing that I can recall. He washed out of the Special Forces because he hurt his knee during the tryout. I recall him going to the dentist a few times, but it never interfered with his training. He wasn't being pulled out regularly. He may have gotten some teeth fixed, but to be honest, I didn't pay no attention to it. He didn't miss training or regular duty. If you got a toothache, you can go to the dentist. I don't ever remember him complaining of a toothache. I know he had his wisdom teeth done because when an army dentist pulls your teeth, you couldn't help but not miss it because you look like a chipmunk. I don't recall him having moles. I'm looking at this picture from boot camp, and I don't really notice any moles. I mean, if they were there, they weren't red or anything, but you gotta understand, McVeigh was a private person. If he didn't want you to know, he didn't open up to just everybody. If he wanted you to know, he'd tell you. He wasn't a whiner, and very few people he'd open up to. He never really complained. Like roommates, he didn't nosy into my business, and I didn't nosy into his. We kind of just respected each other that way. If he wanted me to know, he told me. If he didn't, I didn't need to know, and I respected that." The FBI had interviewed all soldiers known to have contact with McVeigh, and even harassed many of them, but Lou Johnson, who was also very sick by this time, commented on the FBI's lack of questioning during their interview. To him, it seemed the FBI didn't want to know the truth. A number of them reported the FBI and CID gave express instructions not to talk about McVeigh, not to attempt to contact him further, and not to discuss the case. None of the hundreds of FBI interviews refers to health problems. Nonetheless, after his return to upstate New York, the psychological, medical, and ideological odyssey of Timothy McVeigh continued.